From the Historyogi podcast, this is Dave. In 2015, the graphic novel The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye captured public attention when its grant was withdrawn by the National Arts Council. Despite this, the book gained widespread critical acclaim both locally and internationally for its creative take on Singapore's history. Today, we speak to its author Sonny Liew on his research process and whether the book sparked the right kind of debate over Singapore's history. Hi, Sunny. Thank you so much for joining me today on this episode of the History Yogi podcast. So, how's 2021 been for you so far?
Hi, Jeff. Thanks for having me on the show. 2021 has been, in a way, a continuation of 2020, right? There's still Trump in the news. Pandemic is still ongoing. But I think here in Singapore, things are going relatively well so far.
Now, 2020 was an important year for you because you released the fifth anniversary edition of The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye, which is perhaps your most famous publication. Could you share a bit more about this edition?
So this new edition, there's a new cover for one, which is designed by someone from Epigram Books. And content-wise, I think the main updates would be a sort of preface. It's what do you call it? A thing at the end of the book by Paul Gravett. What's the afterword? I think it's more like afterword, right? By Paul Gravett, who's like a comic scholar who I bet quite a few times during events, during talks and exhibitions, and he was kind enough to help write that afterwards. There's also I think 6-7 pages where of a new comic, all right, that appeared, that is going to appear in a book that I'm doing with Cherry and George about cartoon censorship, right? And in that book, we are dealing, of course, with how different cartoonists around the world have faced different kinds of censorship, and we have a chapter that's partly about Singapore. So me and Cherian both write about our own experiences here. And I did mine in the form of a comic. And that extract actually appears at the end of this new edition as well.
I mean, the three Eisner Awards that you got, I mean, certainly, for the first time a Singaporean has received such an award. How did it change your professional career after that?
How did it change my professional career? I would say it's opened up more doors. I mean, I think that's actually the primary function of awards if all goes well, right? That they do bring some recognition and they give you some new work opportunities. And for me, it was, I mean, doing Charlie Chan for me was a real challenge because I had never done a book that was both written and drawn by me of that length before. Like I done some like short stories of 10 pages maybe, but my dream was always to do like long form comics of my own. And this was sort of what I thought of as a moonshot back then, right? Something much longer, much more difficult to kind of make work. And so the success as far as there's been of the book has, I think, given me the chance to do more books of that nature. I think that's been the biggest thing for me, actually. Like my next book, I hope that I can get publishers to look at it and give me some decent advances to work on it. Maybe even grants when I start applying for them. So this is kind of, I think you're just trying to have some kind of roll-on effect of one book, making it possible to do the next one.
I mean, funny you should mention grants because, I mean, one of the things that Charlie Chan Hock Chye was embroiled in was controversy over the National Arts Council grant that was withdrawn. You've spoken extensively about it, but what I wanted to speak with you today about was how you went about incorporating Singapore's history into the book to make it more accessible, to make it more interesting to the average reader. I thought I should start by asking you, why did you choose to explore Singapore's history specifically in The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye?
I mean, in one sense, that feels like, I guess it's something that I've always been interested in. I mean, growing up in Singapore, right? I was born in Malaysia, but I came to Singapore. My parents sent me and my sister here when we were really young. I was in K2 at the time, right? So from K2 up till JC, I was living and studying in Singapore. So in many ways, this is as much my hometown, my home country as Malaysia, right? So the history of the place you grew up in, I think it's always going to be interesting. And for me, when I guess I sort of came to realize that there were different narratives to the history that we were being taught in school. There were alternatives, revisions, or whatever you want to call them. And as much as I was aware of it, I never really looked at it too deeply, I think, up till the point where I started doing the book. But I was aware of these contestations that were out there. And I think this book gave me a chance to, do the research, find out a bit more about history, and, hopefully be able to kind of retell what I've learned in a interesting new way through the comics medium.
So I take it that you did not find your social studies lessons interesting enough.
Well, I mean, they do have. I think they contain the basic facts, right? The basic narratives about Raffles and the founding of Singapore. But all histories, I think, as I'm sure you well know, told from a certain angle, right? And I think, especially in Singapore, for most part, that there is this so-called mainstream narrative, the Singapore story. That's usually what we hear, right? So I think it's interesting to me that what the alternatives are to that.
So speaking about the research process, what was it like for you to research this book? I mean, what kind of sources did you consult?
For most part, they were secondary sources, right? So I was reading books by actual historians. Turnbull, what's the Singapore story book by, I have it right here actually, Singapore Biography by Mark Frost and Yu Mei, right? So yeah, so I consulted a lot of secondary texts. I tried to read as much as I could from different perspectives, right? So both the more established books like the Turnbull book, but also scripting on national history and those books that put out about May 13 and all those more left-wing takes on history. And I would say the main primary materials research I did was to interview people or to look at oral history records to try to reconstruct what it would have felt like to be an artist back in those days, right? Because I was trying to create a fictional comic artist. So I had to kind of get a sense of what people who were in similar industries, in book publishing, in art, illustration, what kind of outlook and perspectives they would have. So I think that was the main bulk of it, the trying to create a believable character in a world that I didn't grow up in myself, right? So that was the part where I think I did the most primary research.
So amidst all this heavy research that you were conducting, what surprised you most about our history as you did this research? I mean, was there any specific individual or event that struck you?
I think anyone reading the book will know that Lim Chin Siong plays a big role in the book. Like he's sort of set up as a figure to not say oppose, but to be juxtaposed with Lee Kuan Yew. So I think Lim Chin Siong would be the person who I felt whose I think historical reputation now for most part has been a little bit whitewashed compared to what people thought of him back in the day, right? So I talked to a lot of older folks, especially like my grandpa, some older book publishers, and whenever I mentioned his name, it was clear that he was someone who they thought was a very significant figure, right? But I think, because his career was relatively short-lived, I think most of us don't remember much about him these days. And I certainly didn't before I did the research. So I think he would be the one that probably stands out the most, although there were a lot of obviously interesting characters who I think over time, just as naturally, we kind of forget and we only remember certain people like Lee Kuan Yew or Goh Keng Swee, and a lot of the people who played important roles in history, just because of time and memory, get gradually, I want to say forgotten, but less remembered, I'd say.
It's quite interesting how some certain figures are so easily vanished from the historical record. I mean, we often think that such a prominent figure at a certain point of time would always maintain that prominence, or at least have some sort of record of the person's activities to inform the future generations. But then it's quite easy to actually erase someone from a story.
So I guess the argument would be whether he's been erased or whether it's just a natural thing that happens, right? Because, like I say, he had a very short-lived career in a sense, and at the same time, you do suspect or expect that because he was, of course, more left-wing, that what mainstream histories say about him will be a little bit skewed as well. Yeah.
What was the most interesting historical source that you came across during your research process?
The most interesting source. It's tough. Well, there's so many things that I looked at. I can't really pinpoint the most interesting, but I guess the one that I guess the primary research was the most different, right? Because you could hear from the voices themselves. So going to the National Archives and listening to the oral recordings of histories of artists and illustrators, I felt that was, to me, it was just different from like reading a book, right? You can actually hear the voices. I mean, obviously it's better to meet them in person, but that was not always possible. So I think this act of hearing someone talk about their experiences in person, I think that to me was maybe what allowed, there to be some kind of authenticity in the creation of Charlie Chan, like this ability, this access to those voices that are stored in the National Archives.
I mean, speaking about oral histories, I've conducted a few myself, and I think that their greatest benefit is that it's, in a nutshell, oral histories are kind of like a subjective version of an objective event or a series of events. And it's clearly biased in a certain way, but it kind of fulfills a purpose by kind of filling in the gaps in the documentary evidence, those little perspectives, those little observations that would never make it to formal documents. And I think that they really do help in making history literally come alive, because you are really seeing it through someone's eyes rather than a very impersonal official document that just states what can be safely stated.
So as a historian, if someone came to you and said that this is what my grandfather told me, right, and it's sort of not doesn't cohere with what you think happened in history, what would you tell the person? Like how do they separate their own family's version of history versus a more considered, let's say, history based on more research? How would you tell them to think about history in that sense?
Well, the person's oral history is basically version of how they experienced that period of time. And I mean, it can't be taken at face value completely. I mean, any good historian would corroborate any sequence of events or details with various sources. But it's interesting to incorporate it into a narrative by saying that, yes, this perspective is just from this person who experienced it in this way. And, it just adds some color, but it's made clear what is the extent to which we can draw from the person's narrative. And it does not mean that just because a person said this means that it is 100% the only way of looking at a series of events. So sources complement each other. It's very bizarre to just rely on a single source.
Yeah.
For any historical event. Speaking of Lim Chin Siong, one of the most interesting sections of the book has to be Days of August. It's basically an alternative depiction of Singapore where the Barisan Socialists under the leadership of Lim Chin Siong is the ruling party, and Lee Kuan Yew has fled into exile in Cambodia. So what was your thinking behind this piece?
That chapter near the end, I think for me, it played several functions, right? So in one sense, it was just a way to have a final confrontation at the end of the book, right? Trying to create this narrative arc where you have, this big final event at the end before, So that was where the protagonists, being in a sense Charlie Chan and Lim Chin Siong, have to make a decision, right? So this is their big moral choice, whether or not they want to go back to the real world or try to stay in this imaginary one that they're.
So basically, this was like the boss fight of the book.
That's right, the big boss fight. But it's not so much against Lee Kuan Yew or anything, but it's more against history itself, right? So that was one function. I guess the other function was to explore, like you said, an alternative vision of what could have happened. Because I think there is this sense that in the telling of history nowadays, that only the PAP could have brought Singapore success, that there were hard choices that only they could have made. But looking at what the situation was like back then, I thought that there was possible that the constraints that was facing Singapore at the time would have forced any actor to move in a certain direction, right? So speculating whether or not, how much of it is based on individual party or person's choice, how much of it was historical forces at work that compel you in a certain direction. I think those are interesting questions. Yeah, I mean, I maybe I can ask you, but what do you find interesting about that chapter yourself?
Well, I thought it was interesting mainly because there is a non-PAP ruling party in the storyline. Because, I mean, it's just so unimaginable. I mean, we are many decades after independence, and we are still speaking about, is there a possibility of a two-party system in Singapore, let alone discussing the possibility of another party winning power. So to see an alternative Singapore where the Barisan is the ruling party, it's just so unimaginable because it goes against everything that we have learned in school. That it was inevitable that the PAP would be the ruling party and that it would be the only logical choice that workers would have. So it's quite interesting to see that contrast. Yeah.
But anyway, at the time, that first election was quite close run, I remember, right? Because the Barisan and PAP were neck and neck. In many ways, it was the first past the post system that gave the PAP its majority rather than actual numbers voting. Yeah. So I think that there was this almost like a sliding door moment in history where Barisan could have won and there would have been a whole different, well, as the book says, maybe not that different a world that we live in now.
I thought it was also quite interesting that the sliding door moment where it could have gone either way. It's also interesting because we often see that or study that period as, that we were saved by a very close shave. Like we could have gone down the bad path so easily, but luckily we chose well and went around the right path. So we should never put ourselves in such a position where the political contest is that close. I mean, it's quite interesting how even now we speak of a theoretical opposition victory as a freak election. So we still see it as a source of danger and instability rather than, well, that's just another aspect of the democratic political process.
I suspect that's because we tend to look at the bad things in the world and those things kind of loom larger in our minds. So whenever we see like a Venezuela or any country that's undergoing tumultuous change, we think, oh, this is what Singapore should avoid, right? Rather than looking at the many other countries which have a stable multi-party system, like in Denmark, New Zealand. So I think for some reason, I think it's quite natural for human beings to fixate on bad things rather than looking at how actually things are maybe in more normal places. We just kind of ignore those things or like see them as less prominent in our minds.
So looking at alternative history, I mean, from the just a common running theme in the chapter Days of August, I thought I should just ask you a bit more about what do you think about the term revisionist history? I mean, what is your response to those who say you're simply biased against mainstream narratives rather than seeking to explore a more holistic overview of history?
I would say that my own first reaction when I saw the word revisionist was also slightly uneasy, right? Because the word revision sounds as if we're trying to change history, trying to move away from established truth to maybe one that's based on contemporary values or, and all those things. But at another level, once you look deeper into it, you realize that, all history is a narrative. Sometimes it's a revision. You're trying to study the past based on what texts you have. So if you find a new archaeological site or a new evidence, that's going to have to change your view of history. And that's kind of revisionism, right? I suppose the main problem would be in terms of values, like we use our current values to judge the past, and I think that's probably the trickiest part of revisionism or revisionist history right now, right? Like I think slave owners is one of the big issues where I think it was probably quite normal to have slaves back in the day, but now we see that as being a big no-no, and then we want to revise our opinions about anyone who had any kind of slave connection. But in terms of Singapore's history, I mean, I think I hope that if you read the book, you'll find that it's quite a balanced thing, right? Like I think the main goal of the book is to make people aware that, like I said, all narratives come from a certain point of view. And I think that's, if it's not clear, at least that was the intention, like the reason why Charlie Chan himself is not always the most reliable narrator in a book. Like, I think his opening gambit is that I'm the Singapore's greatest comic artist. And as you read the book, you realize clearly he's not Singapore's greatest comic artist based on his failures compared to his successes. So I think that's supposed to help the reader realize that, he's unreliable. If that is so, then who is reliable? Is it me, or is it history books? Is it, what are the sources? And I think the main aim is to make people, like I said, aware of the need to read any text critically, to approach any book, any narrative, with kind of skepticism, and to understand that they have to always look to more sources and more points of view to get their own sense of what history, the real so-called truth is.
Now, speaking about Charlie Chan himself, I mean, he's clearly meant to be a composite character of, incorporating the experiences of, like real life people who had lived through the era or had worked in a similar industry. What perspective did you want Charlie Chan to convey?
I suppose I wanted him to be, well, firstly, I had to make him believable. So I did base all of his early experiences on some of the writings of students who were involved in the May 13, student movement back in the day. So there were people who went from English schools to Chinese educated schools just because they were sort of like involved in events. I think so. That's the base model of what Charlie Chan went through. Beyond that, I guess if you look at the longer trajectory, it's someone who is in a way stubbornly clinging on to his ideals, right? As opposed to people who are more pragmatic, you call them, or so. I think he represents that idea of someone who is still believing in what he stood up for when he in his younger days and through to his old age, as opposed to so-called maturing or changing his point of view. So I'm not sure how realistic that is. I think that people who are still like that out there, I would say Dr. Posukai, for example, someone who still very strongly believes in what he was doing back then. Yeah, so I think that would be Charlie Chan's arc, his narrative arc. Yeah.
You mentioned in previous interviews about wanting to tell a more inclusive and complex story about Singapore's past. Do you think that Charlie Chan sparked the kind of debate that you were hoping to inspire?
It's hard for me to really quantify. I hope it has. I think that it's as far as it has some legs in the local industry here, local scene here. I hope that it does. It has and will continue to be part of the conversation, right? But at the same time, I don't think any one thing can be like the main factor in these conversations, right? I think everything we do, whether it's a podcast or a book or a movie, it's just one small piece of the big picture. So how big a piece it is in this picture, it's very hard for me to quantify. So all I can say is I hope it has and hope it will be part of the conversation. I think what's the tricky about it is that, I mean, I know that some schools are using it as text, right? But it's never going to be, I think, an official text, right? So in that sense, it's more limited in its reach precisely because the mainstream will not accept it in a sense. The mainstream system will not accept it. And therefore, it'll probably be sort of something that you encounter around the ages rather than something that's more central, right? So I think maybe the very nature of it, the fact that it challenges the system means that it's never going to be fully incorporated within a system, and therefore, at the same time, that's unavoidable because if you do become part of the system, then you become, in a way, so embedded that you're no longer challenging it, right? So it's this tricky thing where you both want to be critical of something, but at the same time, it's only by being less critical or being co-opted that you really have a really more mainstream, widespread impact. So I think that there's this tension there that will never really be fully resolved.
And given the constraints that you have experienced, whether in terms of archival access or whether it's in terms of government funding, do you think that there are still many stories that you could explore in Singapore's history in future works?
Yes, I mean, obviously. I mean, even within this book, this time frame, right? There are a lot of people who played a big role. I mentioned Goh Keng Swee, but Fong Swee Xuan and all the first generation PAP members, ministers, all those people, or even upon the Baristan. And I had to leave them out because it would just get I felt like it would just become narratively too clunky, right? Because this book is really quite complex. If you throw in half a dozen different people, I felt like a reader, especially a non-local reader or someone who wasn't hadn't had in-depth knowledge about history here, would have been a bit lost, right? So I think, there even outside of this history, even within this time frame, there are many things that which were left out, and obviously there were a lot of history outside of this time frame that would be interesting to explore as well.
Let me just throw you a question. If there is any specific individual period or event that you could cover in a future book, what would you choose?
Well, I'm actually doing another project right now that's going to cover 1819 and afterwards, which of course is when Raffles arrived in Singapore. So that early colonial period. I think that's something which I'm actually working on right now. I'd like it to be a bit of a surprise. I'm not talking too much about what exactly it is, but it'll be, I think, in the exhibition in May. Yeah, that's when this thing, if it does get fleshed out, will happen.
Yeah, speaking of future projects, you mentioned the collaboration with Professor Cherian George earlier. Is there anything else that you're working on?
I mean, I've been talking about this book, this new comic about capitalism for a long time, like at least 3 or 4 years at this stage. And something that I'm actually carving out time for right now. Still, I mean, given the subject matter, it's obviously going to take a lot of research and a lot of time, but I think I'm close to having a overall framework for the book, and hopefully should be able to get down to actually drawing and writing it quite soon. Should I talk about the Cherian book as well? I mean, that I can say a bit more about that because it's done mostly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So the book I'm working on with Cherian is called Red Lines. I can't remember the subtitle, but it's basically about cartoon censorship around the world. So Cherian, I think, went around interviewing a lot of cartoonists, from China, from Iran, the US. So he's trying to get it. I think my sense of the book is that it's a way of looking at censorship through the lens of cartoon censorship, but it's actually, of course, trying to illuminate how the act of censorship works in general. And I did the book, I was supposed to go travel with him to all these interviews, but I soon realized that I actually didn't really need to because of the way the book is formatted. And if you look at this art style when it comes out, I'm not sure how people will react to it because it's not the usual art style that I use. Right? I think even Cherian had expected me to be doing more drawings for the book, but as it turns out, it's more of a zine approach with like almost photocopy, black and white images, a lot of found art in it. And I think for me, the main reason for doing that was to try to make my own art more anonymous because we are featuring a lot of work by other cartoonists. So I thought that having my work and their work together would have been, or my usual style and their work would have been a bit of a clash. So I'm trying to create the style where, sort of my work is more in the background, more anonymous, and get to see their work stand out a bit more. And also, I think the zine team theme also ties in with how a lot of publishing worked in the past, where any voice that's alternative or not in the mainstream would have found expression in photocopied magazines and underground books of that nature and of that look.
Well, thank you so much, Sonny, for joining me today in this podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.